Hi, my name is Kristen Christman, and I'll be reading to you part 5 from this series that I wrote called Weaknesses of the National Security Strategy 2022. Part 5, Democracy, Power from the People, and the Sanctity of Elections. And I'll eventually be submitting these essays to countercurrents.org, where you can find the endnotes with all the sources. So here's part 5. In this series, Weaknesses of the National Security Strategy 2022, I've been discussing and refuting the claims made in National Security Strategy 2022, which I refer to as the Sullivan and Biden NSS, even though it's not clear whether Biden's National Security Advisor, Jake Sullivan, actually wrote the NSS. Here we'll look at Claim 5, made by the NSS. The competition in which the U.S. is engaged internationally pits the USG and its support for ordinary people, democracy, and the sanctity of elections against Russia, China, and autocracy. Sullivan and Biden claim that the USG has a vision of openness, freedom, prosperity, and security, while China has a darker vision. While this term is vaguely uttered and we're never given a clear picture what Sullivan and Biden mean by the term, they eventually tried to give a little more substance to this idea of a darker vision by claiming that the USG and its allies uphold democracy, but their competitors or adversaries uphold autocracy. At this point, policymaker rhetoric has clearly returned to the false, unsubstantiated Cold War notion that the free world is fighting an oppressive, evil empire. It's important to notice that no proof is provided in the NSS to justify the claim that one side upholds democracy and the other autocracy. Nor have I seen proof in any other article where such a claim is made. We're supposed to accept this assumption as truth, or as an of course, that requires no further explanation. Prejudice will fill in the empty spaces left by the total lack of evidence and details. It's a topic already discussed in my earlier essays, including essays on countercurrents and on my YouTube channel, labeled parts 4C, 4E, 4H, 4I, 4K, 4L, 4R, and 4S. So I'll add or repeat here just a few more points, but you can refer to these earlier essays for additional information about the allegedly existing democracy versus autocracy narrative. It's not clear how the USG could possibly be called a democracy. The American people outside the social and business circles that rule the nation have absolutely no voice in foreign policy. The slate of national candidates of the two dominant parties from whom we're allowed to vote for president and Congress, well, we're allowed to vote for more than two parties. But if you want the president to win, you have to vote for one of the two. If you want to vote for somebody who might win, there's really only a chance if you vote from one of the two dominant parties. Are largely from the same social and business circles and the same dysfunctional psychological patterns of human relations and values. We rarely, if ever, have any real choice at elections. Moreover, wealth determines access to policymakers. Wealth determines the outcome of elections. Better to say each dollar has one vote than each person has one vote, and those people with lots of dollars therefore have many more votes than those with few. They don't actually have more votes, but they have that power. It's like the equivalent in votes. They have that much more power. Even within Congress, the power of our elected legislators is drastically weakened by many procedures and circumstances, including the power of committee chairmen who can determine whether or not a bill even reaches the floor to be voted upon. So you can call it a plutocracy where wealth rules, and you can perhaps call it a kleptocracy where policymakers and their business cohorts prey upon public tax dollars to serve their own interests, but you definitely can't call it a democracy. Yet Sullivan and Biden utter this meaningless piece of verbal candy, quote, "These competitors," they're referring to their adversaries, "these competitors mistakenly believe democracy is weaker than autocracy because they fail to understand that a nation's power springs from its people," end quote. How can the power of the United States possibly spring from its people when we have absolutely no voice in foreign policy and next to no voice in domestic policy? Our mouths are effectively taped shut by the censor machines of U.S. mainstream media. The energy we have is channeled into jobs that consume most of our life energy because most Americans have to work a whole lot of hours just to make ends meet. Remember, 1/4 of us suffer from poor mental health, largely from the type of society in which we live. It's utterly ridiculous to say the United States power springs from its people when the kind of power Sullivan and Biden depend upon is what they've been shipping nonstop to Ukraine: weapons. If a nation's power springs from its people, why is Biden now proposing an $842 billion budget for the Defense Department for 2024? A budget over which the American people have no power. Why does the USG feel the need for 4,000 nukes? If the nation's power springs from its people, why not send 4,000 Americans skilled in nonviolent conflict resolution, cooperative dialogue, and prejudice reduction to ease the tensions and communicate for understanding across the fronts of conflict between the U.S. and Russia, between groups within Ukraine, and between those of different perspectives within NATO member nations? The USG obtains power from its use of weapons and its use of money to bribe and coerce, as described in the previous essay, the NSS Part 4, and just like in the 1960s when, as leader of the free world, the USG paid the South Korean government millions in aid to send its conscripted males to kill Vietnamese and fight the USG's war in Vietnam. Meanwhile, the South Korean government helped kidnap South Korean females, also part of the free world, to serve the interests of U.S. troops based in South Korea. This is not power that springs from the people. It is power over the people. Not only is it inaccurate to call the United States a democracy, it's also unclear why Sullivan and Biden call Russia an autocracy. This also has been discussed in my earlier essays. And note that while my own research focus has been largely on Russia and the Mideast, USG accusations against China are also highly suspect, as described in the Behind the Smoke Screen report, as well as several other highly interesting and relevant articles and videos about China, Russia, and Western propaganda on the Transnational Foundation's website at transnational.live. And I've also, an earlier essay in this series was also about China and the century of U.S. foreign policy motivated by greed. Ignoring U.S. support for Ukraine's 2014 coup, which toppled a democratically elected leader and installed a pro-NATO leader, oblivious of nearly 80 years of USG undemocratic foreign election interference, and the support and instigation of coups abroad, coups that were undemocratic both in their process and their outcome, Sullivan and Biden have the goal to maintain, quote, "The United States will continue to defend democracy around the world," end quote. Sullivan and Biden then cry out, quote, "We know that for all of the effort that it takes, our democracy is worth it." What are they talking about? We don't even have a democracy. It's a plutocracy. Yet Sullivan and Biden make it sound like all this effort is actually successful in creating democracy. I've contacted my legislators many times about policies that enrage me. I know several other people that write letters to their legislators, or call them. And guess what? It doesn't make a difference. All their effort wasn't worth it. I write letters protesting U.S. weapon shipments to Ukraine to my legislators. I get either no response or I get letters reassuring me, "Don't worry, I've supported a bill and we're sending billions of dollars of more weapons to Ukraine." You know, they didn't even read my letter. I and others have written letters to the editor and op-eds, and it doesn't make a difference. The effort wasn't worth it. So whose efforts are Sullivan and Biden speaking of when they say those efforts are worth it? The efforts of Lockheed and Martin, Weapon Corporation, to convince NATO to expand eastwards across Europe to the doorstep of Russia? In the first 3/4 of 2021, Lockheed Martin had already contributed $11 million to U.S. policymakers. What does it get in exchange? Billions. Billions in contracts. A strong influence over U.S. foreign policy. The expansion of NATO, and requirements that new NATO members discard Soviet weaponry and purchase U.S. weaponry. Now, how much money did you contribute to U.S. policymakers? What did you get in exchange? We shouldn't have to pay them anything to make a difference. That's if this were a democracy. While the legislative branch turns a deaf ear to our voices, the executive agencies, meanwhile, pass undemocratic regulations. Consider the idiotic ban on incandescent light bulbs. A ban first initiated by Bush Jr., and then more recently activated by the Department of Energy and Biden. The purpose of the ban was to save energy. The opinion of the American population was not sought. The severely deleterious effects on both mental and physical health of the ban, both mental and physical health, including permanent damage to the retina caused by LED lights, were not considered. The failure to properly measure the painful maximum brightness of LED lights was also ignored. Look online. There are petitions from people opposed to this incandescent light bulb ban and opposed to the use of LED light in headlights of cars. None of these people were asked their opinion before the ban was imposed, before the LED lights went into vehicles, before LED lights were used to light up our computer monitors. Yet many of these people suffer terribly from the effects on their eyes and their minds of the presence of LED lights and the absence of incandescent lights. And remember, this ban was created by the Department of Energy, which is also in charge of the U.S. nuclear arsenal. Let's think now. We're trying to save energy. Light bulbs, nukes. Hey, wouldn't it save a hell of a lot more energy to ban nuclear weapons instead of light bulbs? It might also save on some very messy accidents. The incandescent light bulb is condemned for wasting energy as heat rather than light, even though some of us like that heat. Now consider conventional and nuclear bombs. They waste an awful lot of energy, not only in their manufacture, but in their use. All that heat, light, sound, death, destruction, DNA damage of species after species. What an absolute waste. There's absolutely no point in manufacturing them. But no. Even though the American population would likely overwhelmingly prefer incandescent light bulbs to nukes, those Americans who get to determine what will be the law in our democratic country stamp all over our wishes and thoughts. They don't even want the decision put to a public vote. Would you rather ban nukes or incandescent light bulbs? Obviously, the Nuclear Weapon Corporation and their like-minded policymakers want to keep nukes. And someone owning or investing in LED bulbs wants to push LED bulbs. And that's our democracy that Sullivan and Biden exclaim was worth all of that effort. It's the same democracy they falsely describe this way. Quote, "We will continue to reckon openly and humbly with our divisions, and we will work through our politics transparently and democratically." End quote. Who even knew Biden was passing the ban? He snuck it through in April 2022, when the rest of the world was glued on Russia's actions in Ukraine. Biden's actions were neither transparent nor democratic. And where was the transparency and democracy in the USG's involvement in the 2014 Ukraine coup? An unknown source recorded Undersecretary of State Victoria Nuland and U.S. Ambassador to Ukraine Jeffrey Pyatt appearing to be selecting who would be the next leader of Ukraine once Viktor Yanukovych was sacked. They even referred on tape to Biden, who was then vice president, and Sullivan, who was his national security advisor, as vice president, with the implication that they're also willing and involved in selecting and forming Ukraine's new government. Why were U.S. policymakers involved in Ukraine's internal political affairs, even to the extent of selecting its president for Ukrainians? And why did Americans learn about this only through a leaked tape? And why, instead of investigating the behavior of the USG, did U.S. State Department spokesperson Jen Psaki who admitted about the taped conversation, quote, "I didn't say it was inauthentic," end quote. Why did she condemn Russia, who was accused of leaking the tape, for stooping to, quote, "a new low in Russian tradecraft," end quote? In other words, according to the U.S. media, it wasn't the USG that had stooped by violating transparency, democracy, and Ukraine's sovereignty, by denying Ukrainians the right to a democratically elected leader, and by reportedly helping to arm and train the ultra-right-wing groups that turned the peaceful protests of 2014 into a violent coup. None of that was considered criminal or even indecent or undemocratic. It was Russia that had stooped by revealing USG transgressions of national and international law with a recorded conversation. The lack of transparency regarding the reported role of the USG in exploding the Nord Stream pipelines that are owned by Russia and NATO allies Germany, the Netherlands, and France, thus violating international law, the U.S. Constitution, and even the NATO alliance, is equally astounding. Here we have Biden repeating that NATO will defend every inch of its territory if attacked. Russia hasn't attacked NATO. China hasn't attacked NATO. But it looks like the USG has. So will NATO attack the USG? Or is the USG not bound by the NATO Charter, just like it's not bound by every other national and international law? Sullivan and Biden proclaim, quote, "And it is our democracy that enables us to continually reimagine ourselves and renew our strength," end quote. What in God's name are they talking about? It's been the same image imposed upon us by the USG for 245 years. The USA is here to conquer, whether through overt physical power or covert financial power and political manipulations. First the Native Americans, then the Philippines and Cuba, then Haiti, Nicaragua, and Panama, much of the rest of Latin America, Japan, Europe largely through election interference, South Korea, Southeast Asia, Australia, nations of Africa and the Middle East, and now Russia and China. 800 bases worldwide and growing. There's absolutely no reimagining going on whatsoever, unless they're reimagining themselves as bigger and bigger and bigger. It's all the same banal thing. Conquer, make profits, build weapons, build roads, get societies hooked on fossil fuels and the latest in technology, expand, conquer, repeated over and over. Very boring, very stale, no heart, no spirit, no wisdom, no merriment and joy, no freedom, no deeper sense of meaning beyond money and control, no broader connection with all the species of life and with the parts of the planet. So human-centered, so materialistic, so shallow and unsatisfying. No wonder they keep striving to conquer and win the, quote, race to the top. They never achieve satisfaction, and they won't find it on top either. A clue to Sullivan and Biden's idea of how they want to, quote, renew our strength lies in this statement, quote, "Our economy, our population, and our military power continue to grow," end quote. Yeah, sure, the economic benefits to those on top are growing, but not for the rest of us. Perhaps if they measured economic growth in a more enlightened way, they'd realize this. And why do they consider a growing U.S. population to be a sign of strength? The world is enormously overpopulated. The traffic, even in small towns, has become a headache. Within the United States, everything has become much too crowded. Even the mountain trails have become packed with hikers. Try finding a public beach where people aren't packed together like sardines, and where you can actually swim without running into somebody else. Of course, the social circles that make U.S. foreign policy have their own private beaches, pools, and islands. I think they want the population to grow so they have a greater market. That's all they think about. And why on earth should U.S. military power be continued to grow? Is the current arsenal truly inadequate? Were previous purchases so bad that everything is already outdated and decrepit? Or is planned obsolescence built into the weapons so they fall apart every few years? You know, If the USG were actually liked, it wouldn't need so much military power. If the USG weren't trying to impose its ideas upon everyone, it wouldn't need so much military power. I suppose that since the USG is so bankrupt in wisdom, intuition, and skills in making genuine, egalitarian social connections, friendships, it has to rely upon military power to force others to accept it and to feel popular and liked, even if only in a shallow, artificial, pressure type of way. Sullivan and Biden insist that the United States will be, quote, drawing dreamers and strivers from around the world, end quote. What? It sounds like they've been reading middle school history textbooks about how the United States was a, quote, land of opportunity once upon a time for immigrants. But that was a century ago. Things have changed. What percentage of Americans find their dreams ever come true? And I don't even know back then how many found their dreams come true. For how many Americans are their dreams crushed? And why can't Sullivan and Biden realize that we're all daily crushed, knowing that the USG has this, well, I don't know if we're all daily crushed, because some Americans probably don't think about it, okay? But many of us are daily crushed, knowing that the USG has this immense military and nuclear power it can unleash without any democratic voice from us, without any sense of humanity for its targets. Knowledge of this frightful power that's held in the most autocratic way and used unnecessarily in the most despicable manner by the USG is degrading and crushing to us, to Americans. Sullivan and Biden, I don't think they imagine what it does to our sense of to our identity and sense of self-worth. Sullivan and Biden write, quote, as Americans, they actually write this in the NSS, like all these other quotes. Sullivan and Biden write, quote, as Americans, we must all agree that the people's verdict, as expressed in elections, must be respected and protected, end quote. Are we all rolling our eyes now? Why, Sullivan and Biden, were you involved in the Ukraine coup of 2014, which totally disrespected the Ukrainian people's verdict? Why was the USG heavily involved in the Russian elections to create the victory, or the stated victory, of Boris Yeltsin in 1996? The Bill Clinton administration funded Yeltsin's campaign. Now, would the United States have tolerated that if Russia had funded a presidential campaign here? But the Clinton administration funded Yeltsin's campaign. Several sources from across the political spectrum report on this, on the USG's direct and heavy interference in the 1996 Russian presidential election, and perhaps other ones too, like the one before it. According to Alan Gilman on the World Socialist website, the U.S. pushed the IMF to give Russia, the International Monetary Fund, to give Russia $10.2 billion so that Yeltsin could send out checks for back pay and pensions to Russians to make him look good. The USG worked on crafting Yeltsin's image, including staging an artificial script with Clinton that was intended to manipulate the audience by portraying Yeltsin as tough and Clinton as intimidated. I mean, this was all staged. Clinton knew he was supposed to act intimidated. The USG developed negative ads against Yeltsin's political competition. Time magazine even boasted about all the details of American involvement in ensuring Yeltsin's victory in a cover story of July 15, 1996. As the magazine reports, at the start of their efforts, the Americans involved in the Yeltsin campaign found that only 6% of the Russian electorate would actually vote for Yeltsin. In other words, the USG knowingly and deliberately was thwarting the opinions of 94% of the Russian population that disliked Yeltsin, largely for his corruption, not to mention the likely 100% of Russians, or 100% minus Yeltsin, who didn't want USG interference in their elections. By the time Yeltsin announced his run for president in 1996, quote, he had become one of the most despised figures in Russia, having presided over the catastrophic consequences of the privatized Russian economy. This is from the socialist website. But again, you can read about it from sites all across the political spectrum. Already by late 1993, Yeltsin's policies, quote, had provoked such massive opposition that Yeltsin, by means of a dictatorial decree, dissolved the parliament, the legislative body. It was gone. It was dictatorial. Opponents took over government buildings in Moscow, and Yeltsin, quote, using critical intelligence provided by Washington, called out the military, end quote. He began shelling and bombing, killing an estimated 2,000 people. This is the man portrayed by the USG as the face of democracy. But even with the huge USG effort to manipulate Russian minds and steer the 1996 presidential campaigns, it's not even certain that the extremely despised Yeltsin, with approval ratings lower than Stalin's, actually did win the election. That's not even certain. Reportedly, the USG kicked in its services again by helping Yeltsin to claim that he had won, when in fact he had not. Yet Sullivan and Biden have the audacity to flat out lie in the NSS2022 that, quote, as Americans, we must all agree that the people's verdict, as expressed in elections, must be respected and protected, end quote. So why has the U.S. National Endowment for Democracy been interfering in Russia's political process? Why did NED support Alexei Navalny and portray him as the heroic, innocent face of democracy to run against Putin, despite the fact that Navalny had less than 2% of the Russian population support and had made utterly racist, derogatory comments? How can USG support for Navalny be considered democratic? How can USG support for any foreign candidate be considered democratic when it amounts to significantly interfering in foreign elections to promote some candidates and falsely accuse other candidates of misdeeds? If, quote, the people's verdict as expressed in elections must be respected and protected, end quote, then why are Sullivan and Biden now trying to lay the psychological, economic, political, and military foundations for a coup against Putin in Russia? Why is the USG trying so hard to isolate Putin from Russians, to portray him to Americans falsely as malicious, aggressive, unhinged, and cut off from the Russian population? Why, if it respects elections, is the USG pursuing a program of character assassination against Putin in order to lay the groundwork for a coup? It is a program of false character assassination, no different from what the USG has done to numerous other democratically elected leaders abroad. Campaigns that have toppled leaders, killed them, sometimes even butchered them, destroyed other nations' democracies, and ushered in decades of brutality, torture, murder, and hell that made millions of people probably wish they'd never been born. I mean, seeing not only their own deaths and torture, but seeing awful things happening to their family, their friends, their communities. Why did 2 drones target the Kremlin on May 3rd, 2023? Are we expected to believe that the USG had nothing to do with this? Just like it supposedly had nothing to do with the Nord Stream explosions? Putin was elected. Coups, by definition, are not democratic. They're anti-democratic. As Putin stated in Munich in 2007, quote, incidentally, Russia, we, are constantly being taught about democracy. But for some reason, those who teach us do not want to learn themselves, end quote. If the people's verdict is so sacred, why don't Sullivan and Biden realize that interfering to falsely skew the people's minds is cheating the people and canceling the democratic meaningfulness of their verdict? Why, if the people's verdict is sacred, is the USG the world's #1 interferer in foreign elections abroad? According to Dov Levin's 2020 book, in the years 1946 to 2000, the USG interfered in foreign elections a whopping 81 times. Russia interfered less than half that, 36 times. And these numbers don't even include the massive numbers of USG-inflicted coups. Note that this election interference really took off after Germany's defeat in World War II. After 1945, Germany, Italy, and Japan were no longer players in World War II, and were led to believe that the USG also ended its part in the war. But did it? Or were USG goals different from what we were taught in school history books? Looking at the evidence of USG invasions, coups, and weapon shipments since World War II, it's possible that the USG has never stopped striving to achieve what may have been its covert, ulterior World War II goal: world domination. If USG goals were to stop the aggression and inhumanity of the Nazi Germans and the Japanese, USG behavior would have been much more consistent. But it was highly inconsistent. The USG built up the Nazi war machine, fought against Nazis, worked with Nazis, and brutalized populations during World War II, such as in Greece, that had fought against Nazis. It fought against the Japanese, worked with Japanese. At the same time, they were on the heels of World War II, and brutalized populations of the Philippines, Koreas, and China that had fought the Japanese. It fought against Italy, and then supported pro-Mussolini parties on the heels of World War II. It played all sides. This was not a war about morality. I'm beginning to think it was, excuse me, and is a war that's not over yet in USG eyes, because it's a war for world domination. I was thinking we're on the threshold of World War III, but I'm beginning to think World War II never stopped on the part of the USG. The only thing that offers some symbolic, shallow, misleading evidence of democracy in the United States is the existence of elections. But the principles of equality and actual representation by means of those elections, and by means of having equal abilities to influence our representatives, is missing in action. Therefore, these elections are a charade. You can vote for this president who wants war in this way, that president who wants war in that way, or that president who wants war a little bit later, but then in this way. Or maybe this president who says he doesn't want war, but then he changes his mind. And then they'll all ship weapons. They all do the same things. As I've said, the U.S. policy and media maker propaganda machine complains that Putin's been in power for a few decades. The same types of people have been in power in the USG for at least a century, if not two. It doesn't matter that they were different people. It might as well have been the same person. It was the same mind. It's like this invincible mind that exists that we just can't get rid of from our government. Perhaps for this reason, U.S. policymakers always make such a big deal out of elections, in their desperation to gloss over their lack of actual substance and meaning, with a lot of hype and shallow analysis and commentaries. Plus, there's nothing else the USG can point to that might possibly be evidence of the existence of democracy. And so Sullivan and Biden and the entire U.S. propaganda machine make it sound like elections are such wonderful things in the United States. But the choices we have to vote for, at least in the dominant parties, that, when the national elections come, the choices are pathetic. It's like saying, you can vote either for this sack of sprouting potatoes over here, or this fungus over there. And be grateful you have the freedom to vote. God bless America. Frankly, if ever there were Russian interference in U.S. elections in the soft form of influencing social media and providing information outside of mainstream media, it would only help counteract the utterly undemocratic, plutocratic U.S. campaign and election process, which deliberately gives extremely unequal footing to the various presidential candidates, an extremely unequal footing to the wealthy and powerful in selecting and steering those candidates. Just read up on the support given Nobel Peace Prize winner Barack Obama's political rise to power by the Crown family of General Dynamics. Then consider, it's the weapon corporation. Then consider Obama's record of enormously increasing U.S. weapon exports during his 2 terms. And I'm not saying, oh, I want Russian interference in elections. I'm not saying that, so I don't want somebody to misquote me. But I'm just saying, if there ever were interference, it would actually help bring people more news instead of just this propaganda that we get. You know, we learn, people would probably learn more about the truth. Consider how mainstream media handled the presidential campaigns of Dennis Kucinich in 2004 and 2008. He was called names, ridiculed for running, not even allowed to debate by the TV stations, and mocked for not having enough money. I remember that he was mocked for not having enough money. He was extremely popular, but amongst donors who generally had smaller sums to donate. In other words, ordinary Americans of ordinary, modest possession of wealth loved him. Where in the U.S. Constitution is it stated that candidates for U.S. president must have a certain sum of money? U.S. media makers' ridicule of Kucinich for not having enough money betrays the fact that this nation is a plutocracy and not a democracy, and it's become so accepted that even the media supports that. U.S. policymakers are indignant about Russia's alleged interference in the 2016 U.S. presidential campaign by means of using social media to influence potential voters. Ironically, as Alan Gilman points out on the World Socialist website, the candidate who was allegedly harmed by the alleged Russian interference, Hillary Clinton, was the wife of the president, Bill Clinton, who screwed Russians, screwed the entire Russian population with the massive USG interference in Russia's 1996 presidential elections. Alleged Russian interference in 2016 is small potatoes. A few French fries, really, compared to USG foreign election interference abroad. In terms of the nature of the alleged interference and the amount of the alleged interference, it's small potatoes. The USG, again, reportedly has interfered in elections abroad 81 times between 1946 and 2000, not including the coups. But there's another aspect of this interference that's not being addressed. The U.S. media and wealthy donors, including the weapon industry, continually and powerfully interfere in the campaign processes of U.S. presidential candidates so that certain ones will be elevated in the public's eyes above others. I mean, they do this with some money. They can pay for commercials. But ignoring the huge consequences of American interference in American elections, Sullivan and Biden write, quote, "America will not tolerate foreign interference in our elections. We will act decisively to defend and deter disruptions to our democratic processes, and we will respond to future interference using all appropriate tools of national power," end quote. To people like Sullivan and Biden, the only interference in the U.S. democratic process that's criminal is foreign democratic interference. Now that may seem sensible at first glance, but look again, it's not whether the interference is American or foreign that bothers people like Sullivan and Biden. It's whether or not the interference promotes the current establishment of those particular social and business circles that rule the United States. Pro-establishment Americans are welcome to interfere as much as they like. In fact, it's encouraged. But Americans like Kucinich, who tried to bring into the debates enlightened, peaceful, and just ideas, and highly intelligent ideas, and who bring attention to the needs of those who aren't wealthy, well, they're just not allowed to debate for long on TV. They're forced to cave in for lack of funding. And foreign democratic interference, unless it's from nations that support the U.S. foreign policy establishment, such as Israel, is considered undemocratic because it thwarts the power of the dominant Americans running the government. My own theory, and perhaps there's more evidence for or against my theory, is that the type of campaign and election interference that won't be tolerated by people like Sullivan and Biden, the type that's considered undemocratic, is interference that increases political opportunities for non-establishment, non-wealthy Americans who favor non-violent conflict resolution. However, wealthy, pro-corporate, pro-war American interference in both U.S. elections and foreign elections alike, even arming foreign factions interested in staging a coup, are all accepted as democratic. So those Americans can interfere in U.S. elections with their money, and it is interference. It's skewing what we see. That's considered okay by Sullivan and Biden. And those people can also interfere abroad in Yeltsin's campaign. That's okay with Sullivan and Biden. And in Ukraine with the coup, that's okay. So it's a double standard. And it's not about morality or democracy. It's about certain people getting what they want and not wanting to be thwarted by others. Sullivan and Biden declare, quote, "Democracies and autocracies are engaged in a contest to show which system of governance can best deliver for their people and the world." End quote. Again, what on earth are they talking about? What contest? Which autocracies are trying to show that an autocratic system of governance can best deliver for their people and the world? And what is Biden trying to deliver to the American people? They use that word a lot, deliver. Who can deliver to Americans? What is he trying to deliver? Is he talking about material goods or quality of life? A voice in government? More time off from work? Access to nature? Less excavation and construction? The NSS and the entire U.S. propaganda machine display a complete lack of substance to this notion of the existence of a contest between democracies and autocracies. This lack of substance, the lack of evidence that a contest is taking place between democracies and autocracies, and the lack of evidence that those nations Sullivan and Biden label as democracies and autocracies actually are democracies and autocracies, the lack of evidence that they are, suggests that the very concept of such a contest is a lie. It's being used by Sullivan and Biden and the U.S. policy and media-making establishment to falsely justify the USG's hostility towards both Russia and China. Thank you very, very much for listening. Good night.